Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, gay marriage, alcopops, Barack Obama, and the Chesapeake Bay, they are all high on the agenda of Maryland's first-term Attorney General, Doug Gansler. The Bush administration just published, under court order, studies on climate change mandated by law years ago. We asked Rick Piltz, a veteran of the government's climate program, if it was worth the wait. Plus, Ned's story. He recovered intact from 10 bouts of malaria, but a drug-resistant staph infection resulted in a double amputation.
It totally stands what is normal logic on its head, where the assumption is you go to Africa and you're exposed to every killer disease that exists, but then you come back to a supposedly sanitary, health-conscious nation where everything is supposed to work and you get hit with deadly disease.
Also, poetry by Holly Bass and music by Zoe Mulford. On the Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. He's 45 years old, holds one of the top 3 elected state offices in Maryland, and is widely regarded as a future contender for governor. A graduate of Yale and the University of Virginia Law School, he was state's attorney in Maryland's largest jurisdiction, Montgomery County, for 8 years and pioneered community-based prosecution. In 2006, he was elected to succeed Joe Cohen as Maryland Attorney General on a platform that emphasized public safety and environmental protection. Doug Gansler currently serves as the co-chair of the Obama for President campaign in Maryland. He's married to the accomplished author Laura Leedy Gansler, and they have 2 children. Doug, welcome back to the Coffee House.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some hot button issues for you.
That's a surprise, yeah.
Yeah, surprise. When you appeared before the Maryland Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, and defended the state's statute which declared that marriage is solely between a man and a woman. And then you turned around and you testified before the Maryland General Assembly that same-sex marriage should be permitted under law in Maryland. Tell us about how you reconcile those 2 things.
My job as Attorney General is to defend the laws of the state and represent the state in court proceedings. So we took the position, which we thought was pretty clear from the language of the statute, that marriage today, the way the law is written, is between a man and a woman. And we had to take that position. But my personal view was that that law is antiquated and that people are being discriminated against based on their sexual orientation and gender. And, you know, for me to do this job, it's not just a law enforcement job, but it's to seek justice. And, you know, I thought about it, and people said, well, it took a lot of courage to be the first statewide elected official ever to do this. And I thought it just took self-respect.
Statewide elected official in Maryland.
Statewide elected official in Maryland to come out for marriage equality. Mm-hmm. But I thought it just took self-respect. It was so clear to me the right thing to do. We will have marriage equality in Maryland someday, and I don't think it'll be that long in the future. And we'll look back and think, you know, who cares? Why can't two people contract to do whatever they want to do? And if people want to get married, that's fine, as long as their religion allows it.
And as Attorney General, aren't you in a position to abstain from defending a state statute that you think is antiquated?
Not really. We've got to take that position. I mean, my predecessor, for example, Joe Cohen, did the same thing. He was against the death penalty, but we'd argue every day or often to uphold death sentences and convictions. So, no, it's our job to defend it. If we think it's wrong, we can try and work it out with people. Not these types of things, but particular cases. But you know, I do think it's a bully pulpit, and we ought to be able to say, as the chief law enforcement officer and the chief lawyer of the state, this law is wrong, and we ought to change it.
Okay. You also raised issues about what are called alcopops. These are those malt beverages that are classified by the General Assembly, and the governor endorsed the General Assembly classification more like beer than spirits, which you thought they should be classified as. What distinction is there in the law between classifying it as beer or spirits?
There's three classifications in the law regarding alcohol. There is beer, distilled spirits, and wine. Just taking wine out of it for a second. These alco pops are proliferating. They're expanding exponentially. You go into convenience stores now, which is where they're sold, and there's more of them than there are of beer or soda. And the big boys are in it. Smirnoff, Bacardi, Diageo. They're making these things, and through their own language, these are targeted at entry-level drinkers, mostly young girls who would prefer this to beer, which is too filling and fattening and so forth. These are clear, see-through drinks in like water bottles, and beer is yellow with foam on it. So the notion that these would be beer is clearly anathema and wrong under the legal precedent and statutory definition. So we were asked to write an opinion. We wrote an opinion saying, of the two, this is distilled spirits. Well, the alcohol industry got to the politicians and said, hey, let's treat this as beer so we can still get it to the kids, tax it at a low rate, and sell it at the 7-Eleven.
But in what sense can you get it to the kids? Because it can be sold in convenience stores as opposed to...
Yes, distilled bourbon, you can't get it at the 7-Eleven or convenience stores. You have to go to a liquor store where they're trained to look for underage drinkers and so forth. At the convenience store, they're selling Fritos and yo-yos, soda, and everything else.
At 3 a.m.
At 3 a.m., and one of the products they sell happens to be this alcohol, which is, see-through, tastes like watermelon, hot chocolate, grape soda, banana. It's not beer.
Mm-hmm. All right. You disagreed, though, with the General Assembly on this, and the governor took the position after some consideration, supported the General Assembly view that it was more like beer. What were the pressures that were brought to bear in this case?
Well, I testified that this should be treated. Actually, my view is something a little bit different. My view is there ought to be a fourth category. We ought to recognize that these are here, they're here to stay. They're clearly not beer, but they're also not whiskey or bourbon, and that they ought to be taxed at a sort of a middle rate, somewhere maybe akin to wine. And we ought to make decisions. Each county makes their own decisions in Maryland anyway, as to what particular county wants to sell them in either convenience stores or liquor stores. And you have to get a separate alco pops, or what they're really called flavored malt beverage license. And that's, I think, where we're going to go. And the governor, by the way, agrees with that. And so that was his position that, look, I'm not going to sign this bill this year. I'm going to let it go into law. But next year, let's come back and get a fourth category.
All right, we'll see if that happens.
We do.
You've also expressed some concern that there's too cozy a relationship between the college loan industry and universities. What's that about?
What was happening there was it was a sort of a national student loan crisis where people that were at different universities were saying to kids, students, here are the list of preferred providers. Well, there's a lot of people that want to get the loans, but these are the preferred providers. What was happening, though, is those same preferred providers were providing trips and trinkets and that kind of thing to the people in the college financial aid offices.
The conflict of interest.
And it was a real conflict of interest. So we had every school in the state, every university, sign what's called a code of conduct, which says you can't take this stuff, you can't take this money. But if you do, and you're going to put that as a preferred provider, you have to tell the student what it is you're getting for that service.
Good enough. You've made the environment a big issue, the protection of the Bay. You also have gotten involved in a lawsuit. You've joined a lawsuit in order to curb mercury emissions from coal-fired plants. And you've also done some work in terms of trying to stop phosphates in dishwasher detergent. What's that about?
Well, there's a number of things you just mentioned. One, the mercury suit was interesting because it was the case that got some notoriety because Governor Ehrlich did not allow my predecessor to bring that case. We brought it with the new administration, and we've actually won that case. Another case that's similar is we actually just settled one of the biggest history, in fact, I think it's the biggest air pollution case in the history of the United States, involving Ohio River Valley coal plants that were spewing hundreds of thousands of tons of pollution into the air. It was blowing over Maryland and coming into our water. It was a $4.6 billion case there.
Let me ask you about that. Yeah. You mentioned this in a letter you sent out, and you're talking about highlights of your administration to date, and you say we have begun to change the state's culture and approach to tackling our urgent environmental issues. For example, our focus on prosecuting polluters led to a $4.6 billion air quality settlement with American Electric Power. This settlement, the largest of its kind in American history, will eliminate at least 813,000 tons of pollutants from our air every year. This suit was filed in 1999.
With 7 other states.
With 7 other states.
Yeah.
And the suggestion, quite honestly, here as I read it, is we have begun to change the state's culture and approach, our focus on prosecuting polluters. Can you really claim credit for this?
Yeah, for a number of reasons. One, I'm actually the chairperson of the National Association of Attorneys General Environmental Committee. And we have made a focus on the environment. And what we're doing, the way we can be most effective as attorneys general is through multi-state cases. I mean, the tobacco case is clearly the best known. Many of the cases that we have brought are led by our office, and that particular case was a case that needed to be jump-started a little bit, had been languishing for some time. We also have other cases. So, for example, we brought the biggest water pollution case in the history of Maryland against Constellation involving fly ash in the Gambrels area of Anne Arundel County. So, and that we did by ourselves. So we do some with other states. Most we do by ourselves. You asked about the dishwasher detergent, which is another example of a NAG, a National Association of Attorneys General project, which is, we're trying to get phosphate. 10 to 30% of the phosphorus that goes into the water, the wastewater treatment plants, comes from dishwasher detergent. Remember in the early 80s, they took it out of the laundry detergent. They exempted out dishwasher detergent. So we were the second state to pass a law. The first state was the state of Washington. We're the first in the Bay Area here in Maryland. And now we've gone around trying to get other states to do it as well. And I think 11 have. A similar project I'm working on through the national organization is to get arsenic out of chicken feed, which of course the arsenic then goes in the water and into the air, and we eat it, unfortunately. So we're trying to get that banned here as it is in Europe. So those are kinds of projects we can do, some collaboratively and some by ourselves.
Okay. One of the primary focuses that you talked about when you were running for Attorney General was that you wanted to address the questions of gangs. And since you've taken office, you've organized an anti-gang unit in the Attorney General's office, and you lobbied on behalf of legislation that I think you crafted, but it didn't pass, to create a kind of a RICO statute for Maryland to address gangs and to bring them down. Tell me a little bit about your approach to gangs, what the issue is you see, and why you think that legislation didn't carry this time.
Yeah. What happened is we had a recognition when I was state's attorney in Montgomery County that we had gangs. The politicians didn't want to acknowledge it because we couldn't have those in this wealthy county. We started the first gang unit in the state in 1999. And it did a lot of things, help with investigation and prosecution, but one of the things it did was it served as a central repository for information involving gang activity, because they're relatively new, particularly the MS-13, the Latino gangs that we're seeing throughout Maryland. When I became state attorney general, I thought we needed a law that addressed the gang problem. I wanted to see a law akin to the federal RICO statute here in Maryland. That wasn't going to fly with the defense attorneys in Annapolis. So we did get a bill passed. It was a very watered down bill. It became the 31st state to do so, and we recognized we had a gang problem. After that, we were able to establish the first gang unit in the Office of the Attorney General. We're now working with state's attorneys throughout the state in terms of prosecuting and investigating different gangs and serving as that central repository for information involving gang activity.
As I was coming over here this evening for this program, I listened to a report on NPR about addressing gangs in Los Angeles at MacArthur Park, and what they're doing there is the local enforcement people are working with the FBI, ATF, DEA in order to bring in the feds in order to gain access to the federal statutes.
And we're doing that as well.
And resources.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense, because what you want to do, just like in other crimes, economic crimes, for example, the real big ones, they can go federal because they have more teeth in their statutes. The RICO statute being the classic example. Right. We now have a U.S. attorney here in Maryland that is interested in doing these cases and has brought 5 or 6 RICO indictments federally against MS-13, but we've been working with them on the local level to bring those cases. So it's the kind of thing that needs. Look, gangs by definition are. They go through towns. They're not really limited by county, state. In fact, like I said, our biggest gang is MS-13. They're from El Salvador. So, I mean, these are international in nature and ought to be treated that way.
And in fact, that was the largest gang they were dealing with, I believe, in Los Angeles
as
well.
Yeah, well, they've unfortunately come our way.
Yeah. Your office and you have opined that a Gaithersburg city ordinance is unconstitutional. It's an ordinance that prevented people from seeking jobs and people from offering jobs on certain city streets, parks, parking lots, what have you. I believe that's what it provides. What was that about?
One of the things that happens, one of the functions of our office, that actually is one of the most important functions of an Attorney General's office, is these legal opinions. They don't carry the weight of a court, but they are the law of the day, absent some court overruling it. And that was a question of First Amendment rights. And so what happens is we may agree or disagree with a particular position, but we're going to follow the law. We look at the law, we look at the precedent, and we advise government agencies that ask us for an opinion as to what they can and can't do. That was a case where we thought that violated the Constitution.
All right, we just have a few more minutes left, so I want to turn to politics for a minute. Governor O'Malley and Senator Mikulski have both endorsed Hillary Clinton for president. You endorsed Barack Obama for president and serve as co-chair of his campaign in Maryland. What led you to join his bandwagon?
I joined his bandwagon well over a year ago and did become the co-chair of the campaign and have worked with him in other states as well, Iowa, West Virginia, and others. I just am fascinated by Senator Obama. I think that he represents something that I've certainly never seen. I mean, look, my party has nominated Mondale, Dukakis, Kerry, Gore. These aren't really inspirational people. Here's a guy who's bringing new people into the system, and I really believe that the day he's elected, the world will see our country differently, we'll see ourselves differently, and it'll be a really great day for America. And I think he's the most electable of the Democratic candidates. I've always thought that. And so I've supported him, and I'm excited about it. I've never been this excited about another political person.
Well, then let's turn to you and see how excited you are about your own future.
My mother's really excited about my future, but my wife wants me to get a real job.
A real job.
Yeah.
Well, one of the jobs that people are looking for you to consider down the road, Governor O'Malley will probably run for re-election in 2010. Right. And that means that if he wins, he'll be term limited in 2014, and then the governorship opens up. A lot of people think that you're in line to do that. On the other hand, there is a precedent in Maryland. Your predecessor, although he had served as lieutenant governor, served 20 years as attorney general. What's your current thinking on your own future?
My current thing is I will not be spending 20 years as attorney general. I love the job, and we have 800 people there, 427 lawyers, and we're able to accomplish really big, good things, particularly in the consumer protection area and others. My political philosophy has always been I love being a lawyer, and my view is if I do a good job and do the right thing, then the political stuff takes care of itself. My immediate plans are to run for re-election, and I want to make sure that happens. And then after this election, I'll see what if anything, I might want to do. There's other possibilities, but this is a job that shouldn't be overlooked because the power of the law to effectuate positive change is something that I really need to take advantage of because there's a lot of issues out there that we can make better. So I'll do this and then kind of hope the politics takes care of itself.
Sounds like you're going to run for governor down the road.
Thanks for noticing.
Many thanks to Maryland Attorney General Doug Gansler for joining us to discuss the work of his office and the presidential election politics and more. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Dark rum, black sugar, hot water, blood, pudding, crack, pipe, bent emission. Dark rum, black sugar, hot water, blood, mutter, crack, house, split, shin, burnt, umber, black, bitter, house, grind. Black butter, burnt sienna, bitter rum, over easy, greasy, queasy, winter slum. Bitter butter, burnt tongue, speaker, reader, eager, Esther, Lester, Chester, easy, reader, Mao, Mal. Mal, sow, under, effort, over, deferent, referent, expletive, writing, song. Bent, rent, current, torrent, shin splint, warrant, arrest, arrest, beat, breath, dark, bitter, sweet, black, bitter, black, hunter, holy, issue, eschew, run.
My name is Ned Seligman, born in San Francisco in 1947, the middle son of Joe and Peggy Seligman. I spent my childhood up until 13 in San Francisco, then went east to boarding school and to college. And at the end of that, in late 60s, I went into the Peace Corps to what is now called Burkina Faso.
Ned remained in Africa with a number of nonprofit service organizations. In 1993, he returned to the Peace Corps as country director for Sao Tome, off the coast of West Africa. With only 140,000 people, Sao Tome is largely ignored by major development organizations. So in 1998, Ned formed his own non-governmental organization there, Step Up.
We do health, we do rural development, we do education, but most of it is really training.
There are plenty of needs. Sao Tome is impoverished and health conditions are marginal, even for affluent Westerners residing there.
I've had probably 10 bouts of malaria, some relatively minor, others quite serious, but with proper care you survive, no problem.
In late June 2004, Ned made his annual pilgrimage back to the U.S.
Well, I did what I always do, which is see family and friends and go to the doctor.
And his San Francisco dentist.
And 2 days later, I was complaining to my mother of feeling odd or weak or whatever. And she recommended that I go to the clinic, a local clinic, and I did, and they, did what clinics do. They took my temperature and said, take 2 aspirin and go to bed.
But aspirin and a night of sleep didn't do the trick.
I don't really remember the day that I went to the hospital. It's all mixed in with my unconsciousness.
I first learned about Ned's condition via his mother. She had called me to tell me that Ned was feeling unwell, had had a headache and a temperature. And I asked her to give me the phone so I could speak to him, and he was unable to even take the phone and converse.
All I know is Mom said I was sitting around in the living room, and next thing she knew, she came in and I was keeled over. The next thing I remember after a month approximately being in a coma was awakening in a hospital room and finding my life turned upside down.
Ned was rushed by ambulance to the emergency room at Marin County Hospital.
And by the time I saw him, he had already become incoherent and then nonverbal. And then he became combative. So he really evolved very quickly. It's a dogma in medicine that when somebody comes from overseas, from a place like Africa, and has delirium and everything, you have to think about malaria. It's the first thing that it's up there in the differential diagnosis.
Ned was quickly put on a number of antibiotics, including vancomycin.
Vancomycin was chosen empirically because we had a high suspicion of encephalitis or meningitis.
Ned fell into a coma, and his condition continued to spiral downhill.
On the day of admission, when I went to see Ned at Marin, it was evident that his peripheries had been compromised in their blood supply at that time. His toes, his ankles, lower legs, and all his fingers were blue, cold, and obviously had no circulation.
And if you had asked me at the bedside, do you suspect methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, I wouldn't have. He hadn't been in a nursing home or in a hospital, or he hadn't had, as far as you could tell. So there was nothing to suggest why he would have a methicillin-resistant Staph aureus.
The appearance of MRSA initially was limited to hospitals, probably because of the intensive antibiotic use that occurred in hospitals, and with the particular type of antibiotic that would offer these strains an advantage in that antibiotic environment. So in the 1940s and 1950s, penicillin was increasingly used.
The ability of penicillin to stave off death in patients who would otherwise have died of fatal conditions like staph septicemia or pneumonia quickly gave penicillin the accolade of miracle drug.
And by the mid-1950s, resistance had occurred to the point that strains could not be reliably managed with the penicillin. Staph aureus is primarily an organism of humans. It colonizes humans. This colonization begins early at birth. It is asymptomatic and completely silent, therefore. So it's part of the normal flora that we acquire. And if you look at Staph aureus infections broadly, you can trace the organism to the nose in about 80% of the cases. So the thinking is that the organism is hanging around, but if there's a portal of entry, that is a break in the skin, then it can colonize that portal of entry, and then it gains a foothold and establishes an invasive or local infection.
Ned did undergo a skin biopsy in Washington 6 weeks prior to his coming to Marin. However, he also underwent teeth cleaning 2 days prior to his becoming unwell. It is entirely possible that the teeth cleaning could have precipitated infection, septicemia, and endocarditis with MRSA.
You never come out of a tooth or a mouth cleaning without some blood, at least I don't. And somehow staph probably invaded or infected some of these little wounds and got into the bloodstream.
Dental procedures per se are not a risk factor for Staph aureus. Could it? Certainly it could. Could something be introduced at day 1 and cause infection at day 3? It certainly could.
At some point in time, different things arose, that it was clear that without a more definitive solution, they would not go away. Earlier on, parts of his feet and digits did manifest some gangrene. And initially, it was mostly dry, but some parts of it did become wet. And we really couldn't clear it in any way. At some point, despite many local therapies, it became clear that those parts had to go.
The need and the question of amputation became more evident after failed conservative treatment to try and preserve tissue, which would have been probably a month into the hospital course. And it was evident at that time that conservative measures were not successful.
When they take off a piece, in other words, they still have to cut through a piece that's still alive, because the leading edge has to be alive. So it is associated with cutting into tissue, creating inflammation in the tissue, creating a reaction. In other words, it's not like cutting wood, so they don't bounce back so quickly.
After 1 month in a coma, Ned awakened to discover that his legs were amputated below the knees, and the ends of his fingers had been surgically removed. But the vancomycin given to treat possible meningitis ultimately saved his life.
The drugs of choice for treating methicillin-resistant Staph aureus or MRSA, in the hospital it still is vancomycin. This is the time-honored antibiotic. There are problems with vancomycin because of resistance now becoming an issue, and it is not as efficacious as the beta-lactam class. There have been a series of new antibiotics that are under development or recently introduced that can be used, but vancomycin, I think, remains the drug of choice.
It totally stands what is normal logic on its head, where if the assumption is you go to Africa and you're exposed to every killer disease that exists, and yeah, you are exposed to some, but it's hardly as bad as the average imagination portrays it. But then you come back to a supposedly sanitary, health-conscious nation where everything is supposed to work, and you get hit with deadly disease.
I think it was sort of the laughter of fate, so to speak, that he lived in Africa all these years and he came here and got an MRSA sepsis. And I wish him all the well.
Ned's back in Sao Tome, but his life is irrevocably changed.
Well, everything is slowed down considerably. You don't just wake up in the morning and run into the bathroom and wash your face and brush your teeth. All of that takes 20 minutes. Before the staph hit, I was much more interested in the sensual parts, like eating, drinking, having fun. I no longer really care about that. Yeah, sure, I wish it didn't ever happen, but it's just like old age. Things happen and you deal with them.
Nunca vou parar. Às vezes ando de olhos entreabertos. Não sei se isso é esperto, não consigo precisar. Desse meu jeito enxergo bem mais longe. Os olhos não se molham, tudo posso avistar.
Welcome to 21st Century Life at the Coffee House. What would happen if you turned in a school paper 3.5 years late, and you did so only after a federal judge ordered you to turn it in, and the paper you grudgingly submitted contributed not one new fact or idea on the subject? Well, in any class I've ever taken, that's an F. Well, in November 2004, the Bush administration failed to submit a scientific assessment of global climate change required by statute. 2 years later, still nothing submitted, and the administration also failed to produce a required global climate change research plan. The good news is that it did submit the reports in the last week of May of this year, but only after a judge ordered it to do so by May 31st. So, were these reports worth the wait? To answer that, we turn to someone who's read the reports and can make sense of them. Rick Piltz resigned from the U.S. Climate Change Science Program in 2005 to blow the whistle on White House censorship of climate reports to Congress and the public. He now directs the Government Accountability Project's Climate Science Watch program. Rick, welcome back to the Coffee House.
Good to be here.
Tell us what these reports were about that the Bush administration just released.
The White House Science Office and the Federal Climate Change Science Program released a scientific assessment of climate and global change. It basically summarizes all of the existing material from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and various other federal reports, and it acknowledges the mainstream scientific reality, observed global warming and climate change, projected much greater warming in the 21st century, observed climate change impacts on a wide range of sectors already, projected much greater impacts in the 21st century, most of them harmful. And this is for the first time, and as you said, only begrudgingly and under federal court order, has the administration put out a scientific assessment that acknowledges climate change and its impacts.
Now, this is about the fourth cut of the Bush administration, or Bush on climate. By my count, first, right after he took office, he said that he was going to treat carbon emissions as a pollutant, and that lasted for a few months. And then he did a 180 and raised the question of whether carbon was contributing at all to climate change. And then when there became a kind of general public recognition that indeed it was, he focused on the uncertainty about the impacts of carbon and greenhouse gases on the environment. And then, and now this brings the U.S. government and the Bush administration basically into line with the global scientific consensus, you're saying.
That's really been there pretty much since the day the president first took office, more than 7 years ago. Of course, the science has evolved. We know more and more each year. But the broad outlines of this were evident from the beginning. The federal program had done the National Assessment of Climate Change Impacts, and it was published at the end of 2000. And the Bush administration chose to suppress that report rather than acknowledge what it said about impacts of global warming on the United States. And at first, the president sort of adopted somewhat the same strategy that his father had. We can't really have a carbon dioxide policy because the scientific uncertainty is so great, but we're going to get answers. But then he put political operatives from the White House in charge of policing the way climate science was communicated in such a way as to exaggerate those uncertainties for a long time.
Well, let's talk about that. And it brings to mind Scott McClellan's recent book that has gotten a lot of play in the media called What Happened. And Scott McClellan, of course, was President Bush's press secretary for a good period of time. And during that period of time, he acknowledges that he played the role essentially of a cog in the Bush administration propaganda machine. One of the issues that he doesn't acknowledge in the book is the issue of what happened with these climate assessments. And when you resigned from the climate change program, well, tell us what happened.
Well, yes, when Scott McClellan's book came out, of course, it got a lot of news play for the Valerie Plame and Iraq material. And I got it and read it the first weekend. And I have to say, I gave it the Washington read. I looked in the index to see if there was global warming in there. And
or the
there's
name
not.
Rick Piltz for that.
Or the name Rick Piltz, and there wasn't. That was not one of his A-list stories. But on June 8th, 2005, when the New York Times had a front-page article on how an oil industry lobbyist in the White House had been manipulating the text of the federal climate science reports based on material that I had provided to the Times and other media, documenting that from my time inside the program, Scott McClellan had to take a barrage of questions from the White House press corps. The transcript is great. It must have been 20 questions. It went on, hammering him with this. And the poor guy was stuck with about 2 bullet item talking points. It was like, the president's only interested in good science. But they said, But you have there's this story, there's this oil industry lobbyists. Well, what's that about? Well, there's this whistleblower who gave this evidence to the New York Times. Well, who is he? Why don't you investigate him? So there was the classic paradigm that McClellan talks about on these other issues: denialism, politically covering up for the president, and then trashing the critic, basically, or calling the critic into question. It's just one more example, and I don't mean to take credit away from Scott McClellan from writing that book. He didn't have to, and he told some good stories in it.
Well, let's go back then to the substance of the release of these reports and what they will contribute perhaps to the national dialogue on climate change.
There's a lot of relevant science assessment material in these reports with a U.S. and North America focus: disruption of water resources, threats to biological diversity, disruption of agricultural production, human health effects across a wide range of heat, stress, and diseases, and so forth, transportation infrastructure, land resources, it goes on, coastal settlements, and things that the country really needs to understand, because while they're debating in Congress, how much to control greenhouse gas emissions, the business of changing the whole energy system is not something you would do just for fun. I mean, you contemplate that because of a concern about the impacts, and unless you can have an honest discussion about the likely disastrous consequences of climate change left unchecked, you won't get the impetus for a strong policy to deal with it. But these science reports are just one step. It's not what the country really fully needs to be prepared to deal with slowing climate change and managing the consequences of it. And for that, you need to have more of a two-way communication between the science experts and policymakers, national, state, local, resource managers, who have to make decisions about how to implement solutions. And there's none of that in these reports, really. You don't have that two-way communication that we had started to do when I was with the federal program. People who are actually in these different arenas of managing water resources or passing state laws. And so in the next administration, we need the next administration and Congress to put the country on more of a preparedness footing. And you can't have the federal government be AWOL from communicating with people around the country who have the responsibility for making these decisions.
Well, how do you get there, I guess, is the problem. Another way of asking the question is, okay, let's agree that, for the sake of argument, that science under the Bush administration was politicized and driven by ideology or driven by economic forces.
The science communication.
The science communication.
Yeah.
The scientists did their work and then it was translated or mistranslated for the public and Congress. How do you get from there? Can science be translated in a non-ideological, non-politicized fashion?
Yes, I think so, but it doesn't just happen. The world of science and the world of policymaking are two different worlds. They have different normative agendas. Sometimes they have different ways of communicating. Under the best of circumstances, it's not always easy for them to talk to each other. But the problem is so important that we have to find a way to get that communication better. The first thing we have to do is get the political spin gatekeepers out, from in between that communication between real experts and people who need information.
But isn't the part of the problem the scientific community, that they have a hard time speaking lay English?
Well, a lot of them do, and not all of them should necessarily look up from their lab work to try to do that. But I would say on climate change, as much as on almost any issue, the science community has made an absolutely tremendous effort to try to communicate in more or less plain English that we civilians can understand what they're seeing. I mean, how many public issues are there that are actually where our knowledge of them and our concern about them is really driven by the communication that we've gotten from the science? It's not just an adjunct, it's an issue because of what we've heard from the scientists. So that needs to be improved, and the integrity of it needs to be protected at
All right.
every
Well,
step
very
of the way.
specifically, very specifically, what would you propose for a McCain or an Obama administration to do?
Well, you can look back to the model of the original National Assessment of Climate Change Impacts, which the National Academy of Science praised as a pioneering effort at stakeholder engagement. Before they wrote that, and I don't mean just write a report, I'm talking about ongoing dialogue, but there were regional meetings all over the country with regionally based expertise and regionally based or sectorally based information users about learning how to talk together, learning what kinds of issues would be of particular concern, say to coastal regions or to the New York metro area with urban infrastructure or the Great Plains. And then the assessment reports were shaped to try to focus on the issues that would be of most concern to people in particular areas where they had to make decisions. And it wasn't the last word on the subject, it was a first step in the right direction. So somehow there needs, personally I think there probably needs to be a new federal entity that's apart just from the science program that is involved in the communication, education, assessments, decision support, and brokering these communications between federally supported experts and people around the country.
We just have a time for a yes or no question. Let's say there is this federal agency that provides accurate communication to the American public about the current, the assessment of climate change. Are the American people prepared to follow?
You're going to have some very strong political leadership on that. You're going to have an honest confrontation with the scientific evidence by the political leadership, and I think it's going to be very difficult under the best of circumstances if everybody's behaving in an intelligent, public-spirited, problem-solving manner to get this dealt with. So, but what's the alternative? You're going to have scientific expertise and political leadership coming together in a way that's been very difficult to achieve so far.
Historians may well record the 2 terms of the Bush administration as 8 critical years lost in the battle to contain the ravages to the planet caused by man-made climate change. Thanks to Climate Science Watch's Rick Piltz for joining us to help make sense of the Bush administration's climate of inaction. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been 21st Century Life.
Thank God for the radio and convenience store coffee. 3 hours you've been on the road and it should have been done. Northbound to Delaware, you'll pass the temple where Our Lady of the Highway stands looking on. Blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together, we are all alone. All the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home. Red lights in the passing lane, hundreds of pilgrims, all your fellow travelers, you don't know their names. Some come through here every day, some have come from a long, long way. Our Lady of the Highways loves them all the same. Blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together, we are all alone. All the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home. White rag on the driver's door, glass on the shoulder. The ditches and the medians blossom with shrines, fake flowers and a wooden cross, and the names of the ones we've lost. Our Lady of the Highways knows they're yours and mine, and blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together, we are all alone, all the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home. Hear the swish of the wiper blades, rain on the windshield, passing exit 100A to the town of rising sun. Black sky fading into blue, clouds shift and the sun peeks through. Our Lady of the Highways welcomes every dawn. Blessed be the children and the strangers. We are all together, we are all alone, all the sleepless dreamers, all the restless angels. Bless all the wanderers far away from home.
That was wonderful. Welcome, Zoe, to our coffee house. A pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, David.
So did you write that tune when you were going down the road?
I did.
It just has that, the guitar part just kind of rolls right along with it, and just...
I grew up in Philadelphia, and when I moved to D.C., I started driving back and forth a good deal and passing the statue, Our Lady of the Highways. I think she may be around Salisbury, actually. I may have that wrong.
Our viewers out there will write in, I'm sure.
Yeah. Anyway, she's on the right side of I-95 before you cross the border into Delaware. And
it's more like Elkton or something.
Yeah.
But we digress. Let's see. So that leads me to think about your current recording, which also sort of has a roadside name, doesn't it? It's called
Roadside Saints.
Yeah.
Partially because of that song, which is on it.
And again, we think of highways as they have certain markers on them, and I bet the songs are some of those markers.
There are a lot of road songs, and I was thinking about the people and things that watch over us when we travel.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me, okay, if you tell actors to break a leg, what's the right thing to say to musicians? And I had no idea. And that evening I was loading up.
Break a string.
I was loading up to go to a gig, and my sweetie said, "Drive safely." And I thought, that's it.
Right.
That's what you tell musicians.
Right. There's a columnist in the Post, Tony Kornheiser, that closes his show with, "If you're out on your bike tonight, do wear white," which he closes no matter when the show is, even if it's 11 in the morning. I know that album has been produced by John Jennings. That's very exciting.
It is, and it has been such a delight to work on.
Yeah.
I think one of his talents is getting artists out of their own way.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and you trust his judgment, because anybody that co-produces with Mary Chapin Carpenter over the years, he knows. He knows, yeah. Well, that's very exciting. You're also going to play a banjo tune.
Yes, I am.
I know that because there's a banjo there. It's a sparse stage, so we didn't put it up as a prop. What are you going to take us out with?
This is from the previous album, which is called Traveling Moon.
Good, we segued that in, that's good.
Yeah, and title of the tune is Life is Too Short to Fold Underwear.
Okay, well, I'll go back and wrinkle some.
There's one piece of wisdom that sticks in my head. I heard it someplace, or it's something I read about someone or other whose grandmother said, life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to play solitaire. Get off your duff, it's time to begin. There's good deeds to do and there's sins to be sinned, and there's not enough time to fit it all in. Life is too short to fold underwear. I love to get people singing this in church. Life is too short to eat processed cheese or mealy tomatoes or third-rate Chinese, or to live someplace dismal without any trees. And life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to play solitaire. Get off your duff, it's time to begin. There's good deeds to do and there's sins to be sinned, and there's not enough time to fit it all in. Life is too short to fold underwear. Well, life is too short to spend it alone, or with folks that are mean, or a long way from home, or to serve an obsession that isn't your own. And life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to fold underwear. Life is too short to play solitaire. Get off your duff, it's time to begin. There's good deeds to do and there's sins to be sinned, and there's not enough time to fit it all in. Life is too short to fold underwear. Yes, life is too short to fold underwear.